Good morning, Julie, and hello, everyone. I'd like to welcome you back to part 13 of the continuing series, Revelation Reality, the Victory of Jesus. But before we begin, I'd like to just remind our viewers that this is a continuing series which builds on each and every one of the previous episodes. So I just want to remind you that if you need to catch up, there's a link below to the entire playlist. There you can watch all of them in order, or you can look up any one that you may have missed. Julie, in our last episode, we looked at chapter 10 of the book of Revelation, and we saw an angel coming down with a message that was both good and bad, wasn't it?
Yeah, that's true, Rob. And as I stated last week, if we break it down to simple terms, I'd say that chapter 10 shows that the question asked by the saints under the altar in chapter 6 was about to be answered. These are the words they uttered in that chapter. O sovereign Lord, holy and true, how long before you judge and avenge our blood on those who dwell on the earth? So the angel was telling the Apostle John that this was about to happen. It would be sweet for the satisfaction of the saints, but it would be very bitter for the persecutors of those saints because they would suffer greatly. And in the process of all of this, it did have an interesting analogy in there. Do you remember what that was, Rob?
Yeah, I really thought the analogy of the little book that John was told to eat was very interesting. He was told that it would be sweet in his mouth, but bitter in his belly, as we have described just now. And of course, this was a reference to the thoughts that you just mentioned, that it would be sweet that the saints were protected, but on the other hand, it would be very bitter for the persecutors of those statements or saints. And really, Julie, I think this is powerful enough that it almost seems like an understatement to say it was bitter. This has not and will continue to not bode very well for the persecutors of the church. So as we finish chapter 11 or 10 and we open chapter 11, we see that John is given a reed and told to measure the temple. Now, as we have previously stated, that was evidence that the temple was still standing. But since John is getting this vision while imprisoned on the Isle of Patmos, we know that it's not a literal go out there with a measuring tape and measure it thing, don't we?
That's right. It's not what we would normally think of as a physical measurement. So in order to understand it, let's read from Revelation 11, the first two verses.
Okay.
Then I was given a measuring rod like a staff, and I was told, rise and measure the temple of God and the altar and those who worship there. But do not measure the court outside the temple. Leave that out, for it is given over to the nations, and they will trample the holy city for 42 months. And that's from the English Standard Version. So John, being exiled to the Isle of Patmos, he couldn't physically go and measure the temple in Jerusalem, like he said, but also combined with the fact that he was told to measure people, it shows that this is a very different type of measuring, isn't it, Rob?
Yes, it certainly is. This would actually be a measurement of all the deeds that would bring about their judgment. And this is very similar to, and in fact, this is probably where it came from what Isaiah said hundreds of years previously in chapter 65. Let's go back to that verse. It says, behold, it is written before me, I will not keep silent, but I will repay. I will indeed repay into their lap both your iniquities and your father's iniquities together, says the Lord. Because they made offerings on the mountains and insulted me on the hills, I will measure into their lap payment for their former deeds. This is from Isaiah 65, verses 6 through 7. Now, this long-range prophecy given by Isaiah was recognized by some of the commentators, including Adam Clarke in his commentary, wasn't it, Julie?
Yeah. This was a long-range prophecy intended to show that when Israel filled up the measure of their sin, it would result in their destruction. So let's take a look at what Adam Clarke states in his commentary concerning this prophecy in Isaiah 65. For their horrid impieties recorded in writing before Jehovah, The wrath of God shall certainly come upon them to the uttermost, a prediction which was exactly fulfilled in the first and second centuries in the reigns of the Roman emperors Vespasian, Titus, and Hadrian, when the whole Jewish polity was dissolved and the people dispersed all over the world. And Rob, this is exactly the scenario we've been describing throughout this series, isn't it?
Yes, and not only that, but as regards to this prophecy of Isaiah 65, we know that even Jesus referred to it when he pronounced judgment upon them. Notice his words. He says in Matthew 23, verse 31 through 33, therefore you testify to yourselves that you are children of those who killed the prophets. Fill up then the measure of your fathers. Once again, the measuring. You serpents, you offspring of vipers, how will you escape the judgment of Gehenna? This from the World English Bible. So from all of this, we can be certain that they're speaking, what they're speaking of here, that it was that type of a measurement. And when we read in verse 2 of chapter 11, we see that that was not all, was it, Julie?
Great reference, Rob. And you're right. In Revelation 11:2, where it's given over to the nations, we know that the city was indeed trampled on to the point of ending forever the entire Jewish system of sacrificial worship. How could it continue? I mean, the city and the temple were completely destroyed, just as Adam Clark mentioned. But this trampling on by the nations was not just by the Romans, because, the Zealots included radical Jews and many others from various ethnic groups within the Roman Empire. Yeah,
that's right. In fact, that barbarian group known as the Zealots actually did most of the trampling until the last 5 months when the Romans came in. Now, these Zealots were made up of several different groups of people. And I'd like to give out a shout out to Adam Marshall, who recently reported this on his website. A very interesting thing here. It says there were multiple nations that invaded and trampled Jerusalem from 66 AD until the spring of 70 AD, which was the time of the final Roman invasion. There was an interesting quote in Wikipedia concerning this battle. It said on their site about the Galileans, during the Great Rebellion, 66 through 70 CE, the Galileans and Idumeans were the most adamant fighters against Rome. They fought the Romans to the death when many Judeans were ready to accept peace terms. Wow, Julie. Also, early AD 68, there's a man named Jesus ben Gamala, one of the former high priests, gave a speech in which he described what was happening to Jerusalem because of the Zealots. He said, and this place, which is adored by the habitable world and honored by such as only it by report as far as the ends of the earth, is trampled upon, he used those exact words, by these wild beasts born among themselves. Wow, the wording is amazing there. So according to this testimony, it was the Zealots who trampled Jerusalem. And as we have already mentioned, they were made up of several ethnos or ethnic groups. And they were, as we talked about last week, total barbarians and heartless in their actions. Didn't we, Julie?
Wow. Again, those are great references, Rob. And yes, as you mentioned, it seems they had to be sociopaths to do what they did. So from all of this, it is apparent that because of the invasion of these ethnic groups in the form of the Zealots invading Jerusalem, and later the Roman armies, as you mentioned, there's no doubt that Yahweh was determined to destroy everything. So now as we move on to verses 3 and 4 in Revelation 11, we see a change in the subject and the scene shifts. Says, I will give power to my 2 witnesses, and they will prophesy 1,260 days, clothed in sackcloth. These are the 2 olive trees and the 2 lampstands standing before the Lord of the earth. Interesting. They're wearing sackcloth, which is an indication they are humbled or in mourning. But what else do we know about these prophets? Well, there's been a lot of speculation as to who these men could be, hasn't there, Rob?
Yes, there has. And I must say that when I wrote my book, The Lamb of God Victorious, which there'll be a reference to that in the notes below if somebody's interested in it, I said that I was uncertain if these olive trees and lampstands were real or symbolic. In reading some of the Gnostic Gospels, which we don't refer to very often, but just for reference sake, we did see evidence of two literal witnesses, but they were not identified. But it's hard to find anything on this. We do know for a certainty that this account of the two witnesses is taken from Zechariah chapter 4. And when you read this chapter, you see that the symbols are exactly the same, the olive trees and the lampstands. And in that chapter, they were symbolic of two literal people, namely Zerubbabel and Joshua the high priest. Now, both are long since dead, but here in Revelation 11, verse 3 through 4, those symbols are not identified, are they, Julie?
That's a good point to look back at Zechariah's prophecy, and it's fair to determine that the olive trees and the lampstands are symbolic here because they were symbolic in Zechariah's prophecy. So let's see how these symbols were portrayed there. I'm going to read to you from Zechariah 4, 5 through 6. Then the angel who talked with me answered me, "Don't you know what these are?" I said, "No, my Lord." Then he answered and spoke to me, saying, "This is Yahweh's word to Zerubbabel, saying, not by might nor by power, but by my spirit, says Yahweh of armies." So from this, there is one thing we can determine. What was taking place here in Revelation was not because of the power of the invading zealots, both Jewish and otherwise, or the Roman armies or any power by the hand of man, but because of God's power and God's spirit. But having said all that, perhaps we'll be able to get some more insight on these two witnesses by reading the remainder of the verses. Can we do that, Rob?
I think we can. And so as we continue, you've read verses up through verse 4. We're going to go back here to verse 5 and 6. We'll be reading from the ESV this time. It says, "And if anyone desires to harm them, fire comes out of their mouth and devours their enemies. And if anyone desires to harm them, so it is right for him to be killed. These have the authority to shut up the heaven, that no rain may rain in the days of their prophecy. And they have authority over the waters to turn them into blood, and to strike the earth with every plague as often as they desire." So, Julie, this idea of fire coming out of their mouths makes us revert back to the idea that they were symbolic, because in the past, only the prophets were given that kind of power, such as Moses and Elijah. Moses with the plagues, and Elijah who prayed for and got rain. The fire coming out of their mouths symbolizes the judgment that they spoke. But in a larger sense, it seems that this passage is representatives of the prophets such as Isaiah, Daniel, and Ezekiel, who were probably the main prophets in foretelling all that would happen to Jerusalem and Judea in the Old Testament. What do you think, Julie?
Well, once again, when we consider the two witnesses being referred to as the two olive trees and the two lampstands standing before the Lord of the earth, it proves to me that they're symbolic and not literal. So they definitely could represent the prophets you mentioned here, who did speak of severe judgments to come, because the judgments spoken of here were indeed like fire coming out of their mouths, which eventually did devour their enemies. But, you know, like what we covered a few episodes back about the number 666 throughout the centuries, there's been speculation on who these two witnesses actually were too. And much of that has proven to be embarrassing to those who mention them. So I figured we should learn from that error and remember to stay within the bounds of Revelation's original audience, who were told that these events would happen soon. So with that in mind, we can kind of narrow our speculation to two first century individuals, couldn't we, Rob?
Yeah, it's amusing some of the things that we have heard about that the futurists keep embarrassing themselves over. But when you go back and look at what some people have written, we highly recommend James Stuart Russell's book, The Parousia, and we know that he speculates, a couple of people, that it could be. He said it could be James, the overseer of the church, and the apostle Peter. Now, the only thing I see about that was Peter was martyred in Rome, so this makes it kind of difficult. Now, Adam Marshall has an interesting theory on this, and he stated the following concerning this article in Revelation. He said, I would like to propose that the two witnesses were two first-century high priests, Annas ben Annas and Ananias ben Ananias, and Jesus ben Gamaliel, also known as Joshua. According to Joseph, they led the peace movement in Jerusalem when the Zealots were determined to rebel and incite war with the Romans, hoping to gain full independence for Israel. As we shall see, their roles, deaths, and the aftermath of their deaths and the timing of their deaths line up with a number of details that John saw in Revelation. And this is from his website, which I will refer to at the end of this episode. So Adam bases this on the fact that both gave long speeches against the Zealots in Book 4 of the Wars of the Jews, and both were killed, as he stated, and documented at the same time during the Zealot temple siege of February through March of 68 AD. So I must say that when you read the account of this that he's posted, it does make sense, and it is well documented from the statements of the Wars of the Jews and the Antiquities of the Jews. So moving on to the next verse, what do we see, Julie?
Wow. I look forward to reading more of Adam's research on that. Thanks for sharing that, Rob.
Yes.
Well, moving on, let's examine Revelation chapter 11, verses 5 through 9 in the English Standard Version. And if anyone would harm them, fire pours from their mouth and consumes their foes. If anyone would harm them, this is how he is doomed to be killed. They have the power to shut the sky that no rain may fall during the days of their prophesying. And they have power over the waters to turn them into blood and to strike the earth with every kind of plague as often as they desire. And when they have finished their testimony, the beast that rises from the bottomless pit will make war on them and conquer them and kill them. And their dead bodies will lie in the street of the great city that symbolically is called Sodom and Egypt, where their Lord was crucified. For 3.5 days, some from the peoples and tribes and languages and nations will gaze at their dead bodies and refuse to let them be placed in a tomb. From this passage, it is clear that this is speaking of Jerusalem, the city of the crucifixion of our Lord Yeshua. But we do have to remember that this was a vision, and John was not told the identity of the two witnesses in advance. But Rob, we can turn to historical documents for possible answers, as we already have been looking at, couldn't we?
Yes, but those answers are difficult to dig out. And to speak in absolute terms, I don't think we can do that. But now, having said that, once again, we have to remember that the Zealots, even though they may have come from many different ethnos or nations, they were to a great extent people with Jewish ethnicity in their background. And as we have seen, there is much documentation by the historian Flavius Josephus to show that what they did was indeed difficult. And what the Zealots did was far worse than what the Romans did during the 3.5 years. We remember that Jesus said all of this stuff would happen. And I know that we've read this quote many times, but it brings us back to this same passage in Matthew 23, verse 34 through 36, where it says, "Therefore I send you prophets and wise men and scribes, some of whom you will kill and crucify, and some you will flog in your synagogues and persecute them from town to town, so that on you may come all the righteous blood shed on the earth, from the righteous blood of Abel to the blood of Zechariah, the son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the sanctuary and the altar. Truly, I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation. Wow, Julie, that is pretty darn specific. And we know there are many more details we could dig out concerning these verses. Don't you agree, Julie?
Yeah, very specific there. And the section of Josephus's writings that I'm about to read shows that it's possible that these two men mentioned previously by Adam Marshak could be two witnesses. Note what is written here. But the rage of the Idumeans was not satiated by these slaughters, but they now betook themselves to the city and plundered every house and slew every one they met. And for the other multitude, they esteemed it needless to go on with killing them, but they sought for the high priests, and the generality went with the greatest zeal against them. And as soon as they caught them, they slew them. And then standing upon their dead bodies in way of jest, upbraided Ananus with his kindness to the people, and Jesus with his speech made to them from the wall. Nay, they proceeded to that degree of impiety as to cast away their dead bodies without burial, although the Jews used to take so much care of the burial of men that they took down those that were condemned and crucified and buried them before the going down of the sun. So while it's true that we have no absolute confirmation that these former high priests were the two witnesses spoken of in Revelation 11:3, it does show that it's very possible.
Yes, it does. Wow, I'm telling you, that's pretty
Yeah.
powerful testimony there that Josephus wrote, isn't it? But
Yeah.
we have to remember from one of our earlier series that the office of the sacred office of the high priest had been disgracefully politicized toward the end of the Jewish age, which meant that every year or so they put in a new priest, a new high priest with that title. Remember, it didn't used to be that way. The high priest would last his whole entire lifetime once he was mentioned. But moving on, let's notice the reaction of these persecutors to the death of the two witnesses as we see in verse 10. It says, and those dwelling upon the land shall rejoice over them and shall make merry, and gifts shall send to one another, because these, the prophets, did torment those dwelling upon the land. Why was there rejoicing over the death of these men? Well, Julie, do you remember what festival was going on at that time in Judea?
Well, I've got a little note in the margin of my Bible that it was the festival of Purim, if the timing of this is correct. And the description in verse 10 sounds like that particular festival, since there's a celebration going on in the city with feasting and exchanging gifts. All of this was happening prior to the extremely serious danger and damage to the city of Jerusalem. But we need to save some of that for next week, don't we? Yep, and that means we've come to the end of another episode. But we do have a teaser for what you can expect next week. So here's something we'll be exploring as we continue to look at the two witnesses. This is from Revelation 11 through 12. But after the 3.5 days, a breath of life from God entered them, and they stood up on their feet, and great fear fell on those who saw them. Then they heard a loud voice from heaven saying to them, come up here. And they went up to heaven in a cloud, and their enemies watched them. This certainly should interest our viewers, wouldn't you say, Rob?
I would say it's got my ears perked up. I hope they remember that in the past episodes, though, we documented by Josephus evidence that in the Wars of the Jews, that the people in the area could see soldiers warring with chariots going on in the clouds. Wow, Julie, that was a powerful testimony that we read concerning that. So it'll be interesting to see what happens next. Any further comments, Julie?
Yeah. Well, I'm excited. And viewers, if you are too, please like and subscribe to this channel so you'll be notified when the next episode comes out. And meanwhile, keep yourselves in God's love. And Rob?
Thank you, viewers, for watching, and may God's grace be with you always, and have a great day.